What's good, everyone? I'm Zayas, and today I'm going to be reviewing Mob Psycho 100 by One. Today, One is one of the most popular mangaka out there with tons of great series like One Punch Man, Mob Psycho 100, Makai no Osan. But only a couple years before One had started work on Mob Psycho 100, he had almost given up on drawing manga. He said he thought his artwork wasn't good enough, and his art was very raw and rough. One himself said that one of the first series he read was Crayon Shinchan, and it's very reminiscent of that. His peers literally told him to get a normal job outside of manga, and he did for a while actually. But it was only because Yusuke Murata reached out to him that they decided to work together and collaborate on several one-shots, which were hilarious. And eventually, Yusuke Murata redrew One Punch Man, and now it's become super famous. It's had 2 anime seasons, with a third on its way, and so has Mob Psycho. Mob Psycho's had 2 anime seasons, and the third one's coming out next month. Personally, I do actually kind of prefer One's webcomic to the Yusuke Murata version of One Punch Man, although I can see why people would enjoy either. I think the comedy in the webcomic is just great, and the artwork allows for the comedy to come through a lot better. But in terms of the Yusuke Murata version, of course, it has vastly superior character designs, and the action scenes are a lot better. Mob Psycho 100 is just as funny as something like One Punch Man, and it has solid action scenes, but where this series really shines is its great characters. One does what he does in all of his works, which is make his main character, which is Mob in this case, the strongest character in the series. And what that means is that instead of focusing on the character becoming stronger and stronger over time, he instead focuses on some more mundane problems that Mob has. It's actually super refreshing considering the current state of action manga. A lot of them just focus on the strength of their main character, but in this case we get to see a lot of the more real and relatable struggles that Mob goes through. Mob Psycho has some of my favorite characters in any one work like Reagan and Mob, but there's tons of great side characters as well. Mob is this shy, awkward kid who doesn't have too many friends, and he has a very hard time dealing with emotions. Every time he goes through something like anger, frustration, sadness, guilt, whatever it may be, instead of being able to deal with it, he'll bottle things up. And we as the audience see this as a number which gradually increases the more angry or whatever he feels. Once this meter hits 100, Mob will go on this tantrum. But this tantrum is a very destructive and costly one because Mob is an extremely powerful psychic. This is also where the title of the series comes into play. Mob Psycho 100 meaning Mob, the main character, Psycho because he's a psychic, and 100 referring to the explosion meter. Despite Mob's crazy powers, a lot of his struggles are actually quite relatable, which really led me to loving Mob as a character. He slowly grew over the course of the series, and although it was pretty gradual, he slowly starts to make new friends. He's very caring and compassionate to his friends and even to his enemies. And on top of that, he does stuff like joining the Body Improvement Club, which shows a little bit of his resolve. And he takes advice from Reagan. He slowly starts to become less reserved and starts to express himself more, both by talking more and by expressing his opinions to the ones that are close to him. He also does this through the form of his explosions, where he starts to have explosions with stuff like courage, trust, and compassion rather than the initial anger. And it's pretty easy to root for Mob here as he tries to overcome his fears and conquer his social anxiety. And at the end of it all, he finally works up the courage to confess to his crush, which was maybe my favorite part of the series. There's this huge build up before Mob asks her out, where he goes to all his friends, asks them for advice, and he goes on this giant rampage, and it only results in him getting turned down. I kind of saw this coming from a mile away, but even then, I felt like the scene was super emotional, and it finally concluded Mob's character arc, making it one of my favorite scenes. To me, this felt like one of the most sincere, one of the most heartfelt, and one of the most human scenes in the series. And there's really nothing Mob can do but cry about it a little bit and then move on. This was the first time that Mob had dealt with his emotions, and instead of having his explosion meter increase, he just cried a little bit and everything was okay. This was also kind of shown to be resolved beforehand when Mob had the whole argument in his head, when he was kind of convincing himself his powers weren't really a part of him, but he came to terms with the fact that his powers are a part of who he is. Pretty touching stuff. Also, Reagan was my other character who was great. At first glance, he's a con man who's just involved in a lot of the jokes and comedy in the series, but if you look deeper, he's actually quite a great character. Reagan is always there to listen to Mob, and he provides him some pretty solid advice, and Mob seems to respect him quite a bit for that, and I really just love the relationship between these two. Although on the surface level there's not a ton of affection, these two respect each other quite a bit, and they care for one another. Reagan showed up to the Claw hideout when Mob was in trouble, and Mob decided to listen to Reagan when he would listen to nobody else at the end of the series. On top of their relationship just being pretty cool, Reagan is sort of a great character in a funny way because he does help a lot of people as his job, but in doing so he's actually technically scamming them, and he helps Mob out, but he's technically taking advantage of Mob. Even though in reality he cares a lot about Mob and helps him out, he does feel guilty sometimes because he's using Mob's powers to his advantage. His scenes are also incredibly funny. He just manages to cruise through these situations which these extremely powerful espers aren't able to handle. Dimple is another great side character. At first he was mostly there for jokes and comedy, but in the end he ended up being a pretty great villain, probably the best villain of the entire series. He literally manages to get victory over Mob, who's the most powerful person in that universe, and could probably have dominated the entire world, but he didn't because he realized a life of solitude and leading a giant cult would probably actually suck. I also really appreciated the Body Improvement Club. They're these middle schoolers who are way too jacked to actually be in middle school, but they end up being really supportive, kind, and caring to Mob, so I appreciate one pushing the narrative that these guys are kind. Also, don't fall for the same trap that Mob fell into, because working out will not get you bitches. You will still have no bitches. So yeah, the characters were great. Every important character had enough time in the spotlight, and they all had convincing arcs. On top of that, one's comedy is still amazing here. He had some pretty funny stuff in here. Some of my favorites were stuff like when I finally realized that the city was called Seasoning City and all the middle schools had been named after like condiments. There was like ketchup mid, salt mid, miso, whatever. And there's just a ton of funny things. There was also stuff like these two espers, these weak espers having this side battle while all the powerful espers are just chilling. And they had these giant groups just running at each other. It was great. And none of the jokes really seemed to miss. I can't even think of one joke where it just fell flat. I think one really does have a talent for comedy. The one place where people will criticize this series, and I can kind of criticize this series for, is the artwork. Stylistically, I do like this artwork. It does a very good job of conveying humor. It has stuff like Mob's deadpan face, very similar to Saitama's, but it also does a good job at conveying emotions in fights. When Mob's extremely angry or he's about to go off, you can really tell. There are even some great fight scenes in here, and I suspect a lot of this is due to his assistants helping him out, but there's also a very big inconsistency between the best moments in terms of artwork and the worst moments. A lot of scenes feel very bare bones and minimal, and usually I can let this slide because a lot of Mob Psycho is just characters talking, so it's not that big of a deal, but sometimes it's so bad that I even notice it, even when it's just characters talking. So when it gets that bad, you have to be like, this could have been better. The other place I could see some improvement are the villains. Now, these villains aren't that bad, but I just think they're not at the same level as the rest of the series. And I think it's mostly because these villains focus around being these dudes who are just completely out of control, have way too much power, and in the end, they all just get humbled by Mob. I can understand that these villains weren't meant to be as important as the main characters, and that's probably why they took a little bit of a backseat, but there is a lot of time spent on them, and I just think that the only one that ended up being memorable was Dimple. And even though I do love the more comedy-focused One Punch Man, I can't help but feel like I'm hoping for One's next series to be more like Mob Psycho. I'm feeling like a light to decent 9. Thank you everyone for watching. Like and subscribe. Don't be afraid to leave a comment about any manga. I'll get back to you. And see you in the next one.